Hello, everybody. Today's guest discusses his ideas on Marxism, capitalism, and psychoanalyses. We talk about philosophy, political theory, and what makes a philosopher a radical philosopher. How do you understand society? What are underlying assumptions you have behind what you say? Why is neoclassical economics the majority, if not all, the economics in university? Is there an alternative economic system to capitalism? Why is the economy and the economic system in Uruguay so different from that in the Netherlands? That and more is what we talk about today with Martin Kats Liu. Thank you for listening to the Rethinking podcast. Enjoy the conversation. Hey Martin, thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. How are you?
Well, thank you for the invitation. I'm doing quite well. Thank you.
What have you been up to?
Well, now it's exam season soon, so I've been trying to study, but instead I've mostly been reading. I don't want to sound like a pretentious guy, but I've been like reading instead of studying. I've been distracted reading Lacan instead. So that's like psychoanalysis. So I'm trying to get back on track to studying generally.
Cool. So who's
Yeah.
Lacan? What does he research or look into?
Oh yeah, so Lacan was a French psychoanalyst who came after Freud, and he was like largely, I think like one of his major innovations was like, so Freud really focused on like the individual psyche and how like your kind of like individual experiences kind of shape how your psyche evolves. But then Lacan really gave Freud like a social dimension. So it's really understanding like the psyche, not just in terms of like your own experiences, but also in terms of how society affects it and so on. And yeah.
Wow. So how did you get into this topic?
Oof. That's a good question. I think, well, in general, I think like one of my favorite current philosophers is Slavoj Žižek, who is like known for being, I think like he's called like the current like one of the current like rock stars of like philosophy, and he's known for being like having quite polemic opinions. But in terms of like his substantive philosophical work, like he really focuses on Hegel and Lacan, and I really was interested in like going like diving into like the more like specific philosophical aspect of it and really trying to get a hold of the philosophy. And so like I went back to the sources, and then, well, I tried reading Hegel, but then I think I kind of went crazy doing that because Hegel is a terrible writer. And then, well, Lacan is not much better either, but I think it's slightly more intelligible. So at least I won't go insane as fast trying to read that. So yeah.
So what was his name? Did you say?
Oh, Slavoj Žižek. He's a Slovenian philosopher that, like he's very like known for like all his weird mannerisms when he gives talks. Like he's always like touching his nose and touching his face, and yeah, I think I don't give him enough justice by just like talking to him about this, but I think he's like like you really, I think in terms of like like his philosophical work, like he really talks about like trying to understand society in terms of like kind of like this weird combination of like Hegel, which is like kind of like general philosophy, and then Marx, which is like a little bit more specific political economy, and then Lacan, which is like more like specific kind of like philosophy, psychoanalysis about like how the individual subject is formed. And
so how did you get into this topic? Did you get a philosophy course and then you like got into it, or how did you started reading these kind of books or things?
Well, I had a friend who got into it before I did, and then I don't know how he got into it, but then he recommended like that philosopher to me. And then afterwards, I was just kind of like just a little bit enchanted by his weird personality. And then also like more specifically, so he's like considered to be like quite a radical philosopher. And I don't know, and yeah, and then when I first started like university, like I don't want to sound like the stereotype of like, you know, like the guy that like walks into university like a normal guy and then like walks out like, you know, wearing like a Che Guevara shirt and then like being like, being like this very like radical like leftist guy. But then I had yeah, during like my first politics class, I had like this real like wow moment, like learning about like the, okay, it's like a long story, like learning about like the social theories of Max Weber and how like that kind of, he kind of like debunked or like problematized a lot like the liberal social contract theory. And then my mind was just like blown. And then I was like more susceptible into taking like these more radical philosophers a little bit more seriously.
So what makes a philosopher a radical philosopher?
Well, I think radical in terms of like just being kind of radical left. So like Zizek calls himself a communist, but then like when you actually pay attention to what he means by that, it's like kind of like a weird, he like, it's like mostly used as like a provocative word, but also in terms of like, yeah, being like radically critiquing society the way it is instead of like just accepting it. And then also really like going back to like the old like leftist alternatives and like kind of, well, being a little bit friendly to the idea of revolution, like a big revolution or something like that. But yeah.
Okay. So do you learn from like left, is it like left wing and right wing philosophers then in philosophy, or are they split in different groups, or how does that work?
Um, well, well, generally I pay more attention to more left-wing philosophy, but that's just because I think that in terms of like their method, it's a little bit more like rigorous. Although, oh my God, I'm gonna say this, but it sounds like it's gonna sound really bad. But I also kind of, in terms of like legal philosophy, I also really like, well, he was a jurist, but then he wrote more about political philosophy. I have like a respect for the ideas of Carl Schmitt, even though, so this guy Carl Schmitt, even though he was like in real life he was a Nazi, but then I think like the sort of some of the philosophical ideas that he developed are like so powerful that they even like supersede his own like his own actual political beliefs. And I think that's true with a lot of like the best philosophers, that like the philosophical system that they envision is like so powerful that it even goes beyond the philosopher themselves. And but yeah, I think like just in general, like, and I think this is like what I really like about like Hegel as a philosopher, is that I think like more left-wing philosophy, or what I envision to be a more left-wing philosophy, is that it looks at like some of the contradictions that are inherent in society and then really tries to like deal with them and try to reconcile with them. Whereas I think more right-wing philosophies, they just look at like some contradictions, some problems that are inherent to society, and they sort of try to push them out, sort of saying like how it's not a real problem, it doesn't exist, or it's just like the bad people who formulate this. And so I think, yeah, that's why I'm generally more attracted to like more left-wing philosophy.
Okay. And then you said philosophy and law. What kind of questions do they ask, philosophy and law?
Uh, hmm. Well, I think with Carl Schmitt specifically, he was talking about how yeah, so he was like saying how everything has a political dimension to it, and by like political, it just means that like we as humans can like come together and discuss it and then change it. And then what I like about law and like philosophy is that it is that like law, a lot of the times it really doesn't have these questions. So for me, it's like a good opportunity to just take a break from that, because with law, it's sometimes like, it's just like, most of the time when you're applying law, it's just like, this is the way the law is, and this is like how you have to use it. So it's like almost like applying like a mathematical equation. And then like, you can also like think about it like on a more philosophical level, but it doesn't always have to be in your head. Whereas then I think like with economics, for example, and I think this is one of the things that interests me the most about economics, there's, at least for me, there always is like this kind of philosophical, ideological dimension to it, which I think is quite interesting.
What do you mean there's always a philosophical dimension to economics?
Well, I think so. I think inherent to describing any system, you like to even describe something, you have to understand it in terms of what it's not, right? So when I point at, like, for example, the color blue, there's no like inherent connection between the word blue and the color blue. Like it's just like a symbol which like happens to point out at like a real world concept. And so then at like a level of like the symbol, to understand it, you have to understand that it's not every other symbol, right? So like with your background, it's like, I know that blue, the word blue points to the color blue because it doesn't point to the color orange. And then I think with like more with any, like when just like describing society, right? To even describe what society is, you have to think of what society is not. And then you always have to have like a, I think you always have like a normative assumption, whether you want it to not, whether you want to or not, that society should be a certain way. So to describe anything in society, right? Like I have to understand it in terms of like what society isn't. And then I think there's like a normative pressure, there's like a normative assumption that I have about that. So when I would say, for example, um, like the words like the police is violent, right? Me saying that implies that the police could be a certain way, like that the police isn't violent, that the police couldn't be violent. And then I think like when you're making like a real rigorous analysis about like, let's say what the police is, I think it would then start becoming more apparent what my preference for how the police should be. And then I think with economics, it's just like that. So even I think with like Keynesian and neoclassical economics, like when they describe certain economics phenomena, they have a normative assumption behind them of like what policy should look like, what economic policy should look like, or how the economy should look like. And I think that's like inherent to like any thought, whether it be like political or economic or
Do you think
whatever.
they're aware of that?
Uh, I don't think so, because I think ideology, it's like we're always submerged in ideology. You know, it's like I think it's like the same way that if you were like a fish underwater, you wouldn't understand what water is because you like it would just like be like you would just take it for granted. And I think like we all take ideology to a certain extent for granted, because I think what ideology is it's a way that like our brains organize and categorize information and then make implicit preferences about that. And I think that if you always like grow up in like a certain, or not grow up, but like study in a certain ideological like environment, it would like those ideological assumptions would just become kind of like background noise that you wouldn't be aware of. So I think there's like I think with more economics professors who like are more experienced with this might not be the case, but there's like a lot of economic students who aren't aware that there are alternatives to neoclassical economics. And that's just because they're always in the neoclassical paradigm, and to them they take it for granted that you could think of economics in a different way.
Did you see that when you were studying or when you had economic courses? Did you have them with people who studied just economics, or when you discuss things, like, do you recognize it?
Yeah, I think that was one of the most shocking things when I first did economics classes, because in high school, I had an economics teacher who, well, he wasn't like as a teacher, I must admit that he wasn't like a very good teacher teaching wise, but he always like was, kind of like critiquing neoclassical economics and then bringing up how, well, like sometimes it's like really like society just diverges completely from the model, or how sometimes there's like a certain history of why our current economic system is the way that it is. And then when I first came to university, like it was just, this is neoclassical economics, like don't question it too much, just like learn the concepts. I remember I even, like one of the most shocking moments was I had like this tutor, and then there were like some people who were like kind of struggling with like working out like the mathematical equations for it. And then eventually like she just said, okay, like you don't really need to know like the mathematical like mechanism behind it. You just know that when this happens, you need to do this and you need to do this. And it's like no questioning whatsoever about like how he could view economics in a different way.
Why do you think that is? Because you had it in high school then, but then when you got to university, they stopped questioning it. Like what? Why do you think that is? Why do you think that changed?
Well, I think it's because my high school economics teacher was like this kind of radical left guy. So he was always trying to like, kind of like push us a little bit away from like the neoclassical paradigm. And then I think like why it's like the way that it is in like universities is just because I think it's because kind of like neoclassical economics, it just won like the ideological battle of within the field of economics for like that's been going on for like, I don't know, like the past 40 years. And then it's just kind of like the way that like the system promulgates itself. Like it's just, there's only one way to do it and it's the way it is. But I'm not sure if there's like, I don't think there was like some kind of like malicious plot to like, brainwash students into being neoclassical economists. But I think it's just like the way that ideological systems work, that eventually one of them wins out or becomes more prevalent. And that's the system that most people are immersed in.
So do you think we need to change that?
Yeah, I do, because I think part of my critique, or I don't want to sound like this big fancy professor, like, oh, my critique of neoclassical economics, but I think part of the problem that I have with it is that it has like this very like it has this ideological angle, right? So I think that the true problem with neoclassical economics is not that it's not good at like promoting it. It's not that its models don't hold up in reality. I think I'm going to be kind of like provocative here, but it's that like that doesn't matter at all. Like I think that one of the true successes of the neoclassical school is that then like you just generally get this idea in like society that like free markets by and large are good and everything should be structured like a free market. And then sometimes you have some problems like externalities that need to be kind of regulated, but for the most part like we need to have free markets. We need to have like a neoliberal policy. And so then you just have like this kind of like you have like this continuous, the university kind of like becomes almost like a factory to get economists who are predisposed to implement a certain set of policies in the real world.
Okay.
And so that's why I think it's important to change, because I think in terms of how like real life economics has turned out in like the past 20 years, there's a lot of problems with like this just like flatly like neoliberal policies, right? Like I think it wasn't able to prevent like for example, the 2008 financial crash, and then it wasn't even able to recover all that well from it. Like we're still dealing with a lot of the consequences from it. And then in Europe, we have like Europe had I think like the US recovered from the crash relatively well, but then in Europe, because of all like the austerity policies, I think there were like 2 recessions in the Eurozone between like 2000, like after 2008 and today, because it's like, you have all of these economists who are pro austerity policies or like pro just like these complete neoliberal policies. And I think that, and I think we need to change that.
What are austerity policies?
So austerity is when it's when in response to a financial crisis or an economic crisis, like you have the government tightening or like lowering its economic spending instead of increasing it in response to the crisis, because you have like this, I think part of it is that you have like this weird assumption that a state works like a household, that, you know, when your income lowers, you know, you have to like turn down like the faucet of like money. And then when your income is higher, that's when you can like turn it higher again. But then like the consequence of that is that then a lot of people's incomes are lowered even more in response to the crisis, because you have the state cutting all of these benefits, or you have the state laying off all of these employees, and that just exacerbates the problem instead of fixing it.
So are there better ways to go about this?
I think that at the very least, the state could increase spending in response to a crisis, right? So you have like the counter cyclical policies that like sort of like Keynes envisioned, right? So like the state doing like public works spending, or just like hiring more people to do all these different projects, or maybe like subsidizing companies to hire more people. Or I think even, I think that like within our current system, I think that's like sort of what the best option the state can take towards this. And I think it's a certainly preferable alternative to austerity.
Don't you get then a big debt problem if you do it like that?
Well, yeah, I think like to a certain extent, like that isn't for a state isn't as big of a problem, because like in terms of like the material wealth of like the people, like you still like the impact isn't as much, right? So like if the US goes into debt so that it can like import all of these like cars from like China, for example, like the people in the US like they're still richer in terms of cars, and then they like have to like richer in the immediate term in terms of cars, and then they have to pay them off in the future. But I have to admit that like this part of like this like more on Keynesian economics, I used to be better acquainted with it before than I am now, because now I've mostly like been thinking of more like alternatives of how we can change, like how can we like move away from like a capitalist system altogether, rather than how can we have like a better response to like financial crises and like or economic crises in like the midterm.
Okay, so are there better systems than capitalism?
Well, for me, I think that a preferable system would be like, okay, like a socialist planned economy, where you have you do economic planning through like computers, and then you have like an allocation of goods based on what people actually need, instead of an allocation of goods by market forces, which is mostly like profit driven. Because I think like so okay, so like I'll come back to that later, but I think like so with like Marx, right? So one of the main points that Marx makes in his economic analysis is like, look, the economy isn't driven by like people's like utility functions that they have in their head, or it's not driven by trying to like provide the best services for the lowest cost. Like that can be part of it, but the main engine of like our current economic system is profit, right? And then that leads to like to firms in an economy like making all of these like different choices, because or all of these like weird choices, because like their concern is maintaining profitability. And so then sometimes you have, and so for Marx, like for example, this is like one of the sources of economic crises, because you just have cases where a company produces more than there are people to like buy those products, and then they like go bankrupt. And then, well, okay, so it's like there's like a much deeper explanation with that, but that's like the basic idea. And so then so among that, like you just have all of like these general problems of like companies blindly pursuing profit. And then I think that with like a more planned system, like we can like it would just we could think of like different alternatives to like produce and distribute goods. And I think like that's the and then I think like so then like like in the 20th century or like before that in like the 19th century, you had like this critique towards like this idea of like economic planning that was called like the calculation problem, right? And it was like people, I think like von Mises, who said that it's just impossible to do this because the economy is too complicated. And I think that that may have been true back then, but then today I think like computer technology is just has advanced so much that I think that it is possible. And actually companies today, like really big companies like Walmart, they already do economic planning, right? Because Walmart like knows, like it can make calculations to predict where they have to send certain products at a certain time, because that's where more people have to buy them. And if you were to look at Walmart like as a country, the economy of like Walmart is bigger than the economy of Poland. So I think that, yeah, in terms of like technological possibility, we could do this. And I think it's just it's almost like a question of like having the political or like even like just the creative will to imagine a different system than what we have today.
But would you want a system like that where everything was planned out for people? Like, is there an independent choice?
I think you do, because I think you'd be able to make like a lot more meaningful choices. So I think that like, for example, all the variety that like capitalist competition gives, I don't think it's that meaningful, because I don't think it's that meaningful to be able to choose between 10 different types of toothpaste or 5 different types of deodorant. I think that like with a planned system would be much easier for people to come together and say like, okay, like what's the best type of like toothpaste or deodorant that we can make? And then instead of like competing for profit, you have people collaborating to make the best product, or then like finding out like, yeah, what are the best possible alternatives for this? And I think like, and so then I don't think that like, yeah, just like focusing on consumer choice would be like, I don't think that in terms of consumer choice that much would change. And I think that in terms of choosing how we produce, then we would have a lot more freedom, because right now under a more like capitalist system, like there's all of like this more, like you're always pressured by like all of these different market forces to like keep producing, right? And or to, you don't have that much freedom to choose, or you're very constrained in choosing what you produce and how you produce it. But then I think, because yeah, like you just have all of like these different firms competing and not being able to communicate with each other. But then I think if you bring people together and people can choose like in a more democratic way how to produce, and then plan how to produce it and distribute it, I think yeah, that could be a more meaningful, I think that could bring that could give people like more meaningful choices.
Okay. So what they say about capitalism is that it's efficient, right? And very innovative. Would that still work in such a society?
Yeah, because so I think like for Marx, right, there's like this common misconception that he just like hated capitalism, and like that's not true. Like Marx, in a way, he really admires like just the increase in production and all the innovation that capitalism was able to bring before feudalism. And I think like a move towards a planned economy would just to keep this all of like this these like productive and technological capabilities, but then have it in like a more controlled way. And then I think that in a current economy, like some parts of it are very efficient, but then because like the main engine of it is profit, then it sometimes you have perverse incentives for the way that companies produce. Like I don't know what would be a good example for this. Like, well, I think it's like a rather outdated example, but like in the I think like yeah in the late 1800s, you had like, for example, a light bulb cartel forming that said, okay, we're going to produce light bulbs that only last like a very short amount of time, and then we're going to produce it at this amount so that people like can, so that like we can like make more money. But then, you know, it's like, why not produce light bulbs which last longer? But like, yeah, eventually this cartel collapsed and so on. But then, yeah, I think instead of having to like rely on just blind competition and efficiency, I just think that cooperation between people would ultimately be a better way to organize ourselves.
Interesting. So is it then kind of shifting the values that society is based upon?
Yeah, I think so, because I think a consequence of having like a capitalist society is that you have like a you end up having like a very individualistic system where like you really like encourage people and like entrepreneurs to like be like, yeah, like this very independent from each other. But then I think that like the only way to truly realize your individuality is through other people. So I think under a consequence under capitalism is that we have all of this individualism, but then it leaves us like as very like solitary, isolated people. But then I think with like a more cooperative system, like you would still be able to retain individualistic values, but in general, it would be, yeah, like it would be a shift towards thinking more cooperatively or thinking more communally, maybe.
Interesting. Okay, so
Yeah.
I do want to go back a little bit because you started studying PPLE in like that's political, what was it?
Oh yeah.
Psychology,
So politics,
law,
psychology, law, and economics.
and you chose to specialize in law, right?
Yeah, yeah. So everyone like listening, like, you know, take everything what I have to say with a grain of salt, because, you know, it's like, it's not even that I'm just like a bachelor's student, but it's that I'm a bachelor's law student. So it's like, okay, what do I know about economics? But
Well, it's a different
yeah.
perspective, right? And that's kind of
Yeah.
interesting to hear. So, why did you choose law out of those four?
Okay, I think in all honesty, it was like a very almost like cynical choice that I made. Uh, because, well, okay, so I think in terms of law, like I really like how law, like the way of, and like the mode of analysis in law is very analytical. And so even though I'm not like necessarily interested in becoming like a lawyer or a judge or a jurist or whatever, like I really like the mentality that it gives you to organize different things and like and applying these concepts. And then I think also, but then just like from a more practical choice, I think like I'm also just as interested in like politics too, but then I also think that law would open more doors for me than politics does. So I guess I might be making, you know, like the like the very individualistic capitalist choice in choosing law.
Why do you
But
think that
yeah.
is? Why do you think law opens more doors?
Uh yeah, because I think, I don't know, I think like this might not be true in practice, but my perception is that like, I don't know, like maybe like a company or a job might be willing to hire like more like law students and just like politics students, because I think in general, like all like the idea of a law degree is kind of valued more in society.
So, are law students then very different from political students?
Mm, honestly, I'm not that sure. I don't know. I haven't had like that much of a that big a sample to study to know if how, in what ways law students are different. And also I haven't really taken that many politics courses, so I don't really have that much to compare it against.
Okay. So, coming to study here, you came in from Uruguay, right?
Hmm. Yes, I came from Uruguay. Yeah, I'm just drinking mate, which is like a Uruguayan slash Argentinian, but you know, between you and me, it's Uruguayan. Like kind of like tea. But yeah, I came here from Uruguay, yeah, in South America.
So why did you come to the Netherlands to study?
Well, my grandfather is Dutch, and so I would always like come to the Netherlands to kind of like visit and learn about the country when I was little. And so I was just like always enchanted by the idea of coming to live in the Netherlands and studying here. And it was always like my dream.
So how are the Netherlands and Uruguay different? Like what are the big things that you maybe miss or
Well, I think in terms of like the quality of just services in general and like public transport, the Netherlands is much better, in part because it is like a wealthier country, so it can afford to have like fancier things. Uh, and, and then like, like in the Netherlands, I think like there's like a very kind of like, like Lutheran work ethic. So people are generally like, you could say that they in a way they are more like disciplined than people in Uruguay. But then one of the things that I do miss is that like people in Uruguay are like very like relaxed and like more like no, I don't mean like any insult to like the Dutch, but like I feel like compared to like the Dutch, like Uruguayans are much warmer. Although it's quite strange because Uruguay and like Argentina are quite notorious in Latin America for being like some of the coldest countries, like in terms of the people. But then yeah, I think I really miss the people of Uruguay and like speaking Spanish too.
okay. So economically wise, like is it very different to live here as it is to live in Uruguay?
Mm, yeah, I think, well, for one of the biggest differences that I noticed between the Netherlands and Uruguay is that in Uruguay there's still a much more militant, there's more militant unions than there are in the Netherlands. So like walking around in Uruguay, like it would be way more common to see like workers striking and protesting than here in the Netherlands, for example.
Why do you think that is?
Uh, well, I think in part it's because I think like uh, the left in South America it didn't suffer as much from like the shock of like the Soviet Union collapsing as the left did in Europe. So I think like that's still like a trauma that the European left like is still kind of trying to struggle to recover from. And when it happened, like a lot of more like radical left people just like thought like, okay, we're going to like give up and accept like the neoliberal paradigm, and this is like just the way it is now, and we're not going to like, yeah, we're not going to like organize, like try to keep organizing labor unions and so on, as yeah, like people in like South America in general did. And then I also think that, like there is a side to like the neoliberal policies like in Netherlands and like in like different parts of Europe that like it did make a lot of people wealthier, I think overall. And I think in the long term there's like a lot of problems associated with that, but there were a lot of people whose like status were elevated, and so there just wasn't like the need to like there it just wasn't seen that there was like a pressing need to organize labor anymore. Whereas in South America, you still have like the darker side of like neoliberal politics of having like all of this kind of like poverty and disenfranchisement from it. And I think in response to that, there still is like a more radical worker force there.
Okay. So that is that is then a societal and economic, is that a history thing? And like how did that come about? Was it
Uh,
always that way?
well, I think it's, hmm, yeah, I'm not entirely sure because, well, in Uruguay, we did also have like this trauma of like in the 1970s, like in South America in general, there were all of these like kind of like US backed right wing dictatorships that did a lot to like suppress militant labor unions and like left-wing parties in general. But then I think like even after that, in a lot of South American countries, there is still like this willingness to still fight for that idea despite all the repression. And I think like the difference was that like in Europe, this right-wing turn was like promoted in like a positive way, right? So like people were convinced that like, oh, look, like all these like more neoliberal free market policies are going to give you more choice. They're going to give you like a higher income. It was like enforced in a very positive way. Whereas I think in like South America, it was enforced in a very like harsh and repressive way. And then maybe like in terms of how people reacted to that, they were less willing to accept those ideas.
What do you mean? Do you have an example of how that went in Uruguay or in South America
Well, in South America, it was just
in the
yeah,
1970s?
yeah, and then I think so it would so like all of like these neoliberal policies were implemented in terms of what's called like the shock doctrine, right? So it's like on like a political level, you would have all of like these dictatorships kind of like shocking the population by like what's called like disappearing people. So just kind of like kidnapping and assassinating people like very quietly, so people would know that like these other people were gone. But then there would always be like this insecurity of like, well, are they really dead or are they still alive? Or just like assassinating different like left-wing figures, and then like like really cracking down on like protests and like shooting protesters and so on. And then so that was like what was happening on the political level. And so while people were like focused about that and scared about that, like these dictatorships were also like rolling back a lot of like social democratic reforms and implementing all like these very like neoliberal free market reforms. So I think like the biggest example of that is like in Chile, right? So in Chile, you have one of the most repressive dictatorships under Pinochet, who at the same time is receiving all of like these University of Chicago trained economists, like the Chicago boys, who are creating all of like these free market reforms in the country. So that like you have you have like so much repression and you scare people so much that they then like don't protest at all these other reforms that are happening.
Okay, so how did they get into South America? Was it like companies, universities? How did they get a foothold there?
Well, part of it was that I think it was like that there were like people in the United States who wanted to have like this kind of like lab to test out like all of these like free market reforms. And then Pinochet was very closely connected with the United States. So I think like they collaborated together to implement all of these reforms, and then to like allow for a lot of like Chilean university students to go to the US and then like study under all of like these people like Milton Friedman, and then come back to Chile and then create all of these policies.
Wow. So did you realize this while you were living in Uruguay? Did you hear about this at all? Or
Yeah, yeah, because I think it's like just at least like the political aspect of this is like still like really present in like just people's consciousness in general, and that this happened like in South America. But then I don't know, I guess I just wasn't like interested enough in the politics of it back like in general back when I was living in Uruguay. And then when I came here and then started studying politics more is when I started like researching this more in depth.
so they sometimes say that power is not really in economic models. Is that what you experienced when you started looking at that situation more?
uh yeah, because so like in economics, like with different things like free trade, or just like the way that the market works, you kind of assume that you have like two actors on equal standing who are just like like coming together to maximize their own utility functions, and then having economic life in that way. But then in real life, when you look at history, yeah, in general, like you find that no, there are all these like different power relations influencing how economics works out, right? I think like the biggest example maybe in Europe is like colonialism, right? And it's like in part that Europe was able to extract a lot of like the wealth that it has today through like its colonial possessions in like Europe, or like the UK with like India, or the Netherlands with Indonesia. And I think that like when you're studying like developmental economics or even like trade economics, like that's not something that's like really highlighted at all, how you have like this history of like power and like military conquest and exploitation, or even just like different countries being in like different economic levels, and then one country being able to negotiate a better trade deal at the expense of like the other. You don't really have like this focus in economics, at least in mainstream one economics.
Interesting. So how would economics change if you did have this focus?
Mm. Well, for me, it's realizing that in part, like having this like having like equality on paper doesn't mean equality in practice. And also just, I think it would really like force us to rethink how current institutions like the World Bank or the IMF like operate, and how, or like also like the World Trade Organization, how these different organizations operate, and then maybe like force us to think like, okay, can we distribute global wealth more equally?
How would we go about doing that?
Ah.
Any ideas?
Hmm.
Like, where would you start?
Yeah.
Maybe not like that, but like, where
Hmm.
would you start if you have such a big problem? What would be a point where you're like, well, maybe we could start here?
Hmm. Well, I think that within the confines of our current system, one of the like very least things we could do, I think, is like remove all of this emphasis on free trade. Because I think free trade is one of the ways that this very unequal development persists, right? Because then what happens is with free trade is that it's really difficult for the economies of developing countries to develop, because so many of their local industries get outcompeted by like more developed Western nations whose industries have already existed for a very long time and are just able to produce for much cheaper and much more than the industries of these developing nations. And then under a free trade regime, like there's no way that you can prevent this from happening, because your market can just get flooded by all of these foreign goods. And then what happens is that you then force developing countries, you like force them, or like you create this very strong incentive um, for only like having like resource extraction infrastructure developing, which of course, like selling raw resources is much, like you make a lot less money from that than selling like an iPhone or a computer. And so I think, yeah, like just giving countries the ability to like select certain industries that say, okay, we want to protect these, and then we want to develop these sectors locally without like foreign interference, would be a way to equalize development.
Okay. Okay, so a little other topic. Because I also heard that you're part of Rethinking Amsterdam, where you're working on a lecture series.
Oh yes, yeah. So I think it's actually starting. What day is today? Today's the 17th. I think our first lecture is coming up soon. Coming up in
Nice.
2 weeks.
So, what kind of topics were you interested in that you found speakers for, or that you're looking into speakers for?
Well, I think right now, okay, well, so the speaker that I'm looking forward the most is the speaker that, well, I invited. So, okay, yeah, it's kind of like a selfish thing to say, maybe, but so I invited, or we got Anwar Shaikh, who's like this economist at the New School, to give a lecture. I think that one is November 19th. And I think he really interests me because a lot of like his focus in economics is like going back to like classical political economy. So looking at like Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and Marx, and then taking their systems and then like really seeing if they're applicable to the to like the current world. And then like I think like the interesting conclusion that he comes out of it is that they are, and it's a much more effective tool to analyze the current world than just neoclassical economics. And so that's like what the talk is going to be about. And I'm really looking
Oh,
forward to it.
interesting. Okay, so is that online? Is that where can people find
Yes,
that?
it'll be held through Zoom. I believe that that you can already sign up for the first lecture, and if you go, which was put up on the Rethinking Economics Facebook page, and I think that if people go there and then they scan the QR code that's on the poster for that, you can already sign up for the first 3 lectures if you want. And the lecture, and so yeah, the economist that I invited he's the 3rd lecture. And so yeah, if you're interested, I think people should go on there and yeah, sign up.
Awesome. Okay, so let's see. With every person, we do a little lightning rounds. And so I ask you a question and just say the first thing that comes up. Okay?
Okay.
Okay.
Cool.
What is a skill any economist should learn?
I think, yeah, I would say the first thing that comes to mind. Well, actually, the first thing that comes to mind with for me, it's like to read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because I think well, so it's like a fiction book and it has almost nothing to do with economics, but it's like just a book that like, I don't know, it's like one of my favorite books. And I think it's a book that like teaches people just how, like, it shows that like you can really love life. And like just the beauty of life and how there's like just so much more than just economics, like that life really is about the relations you build with other people. But I guess this isn't very good advice just to economists. So then the other thing that comes up to my mind is to read Marx and like to really pay attention and like try to engage with the arguments that he's making, because I think even if you disagree with them, I think that the critiques that he brings up are still very valid, and that yeah, like you should try to find a way to engage with them.
Okay. So who do you admire or look up to in economics?
Oh my goodness. I don't know. Nothing comes to mind.
Nobody? You don't look up to
No.
anybody?
Yeah, because I just don't think that we should elevate economists to like a higher level. I think they're people like anyone else. I think in terms of like, okay, like in terms of like pure work, I like Marx. I like this guy Anwar Shaikh. I like people like Richard Wolff or David Harvey. But then yeah, I don't think that I would say that I look up to any of these people. I think I like the ideas that they present.
Okay, interesting. What is the question you want me to ask that I haven't asked you yet?
Question that okay, what is like one of the most important things that Marx introduces to economics? I think is like one of the
Okay, so what would be your answer to that?
So for me, it's like the intervention. It's like Marx's kind of like, I think discovery is not like the right word for it, but like his introduction of like the idea of surplus value into the economy. So what Marx says is that, okay, so first of all, for Marx, the value that like a commodity has, it comes from the amount of labor time put into it. And then his reasoning for this is quite straightforward. It's that like, well, what do all commodities have in common? It's that at a certain point, like you have to go from raw goods, like raw materials, and then you have to transform them through labor into like a commodity. And then I think there's like empirical research that thinks that that shows this to be true, to actually hold true in practice, that like this like labor time then can be translated into direct prices. But then one of the consequences for this is that there's this thing called surplus value, right? So like a worker in a factory works, I don't know, like let's say like 8 hours per day, but then his boss, or like to make a profit, he just has to pay the worker less like money than the worker produces for the company, because that's just the way that you make a profit. Like it's not that like it's people who are like evil and want to steal, but it's just that structurally like this is a way that you like play the game under capitalism. And then what this introduces is that it says like, look, there's like a very fundamental contradiction within capitalism, which is that like for profit to exist, which and profit would be like the main engine of capitalism, for this to exist, like the capitalist has to take something like he or she doesn't produce. And then if you pay attention to like very pro-capitalist like philosophy, so for example, like Ayn Rand, who, yeah, she's like the arch kind of like libertarian philosopher. She wrote like this one book called Atlas Shrugged, which I unfortunately, okay, I don't want to sound pretentious, so I don't want to say that I wasted my time reading it, but I kind of did waste my time reading it because it's just kind of, I think it's kind of poorly written. But one of the very interesting things about it is that she has this chapter in the book called A equals A, right? And the implication of this is that like, look, there is no conflict under capitalism. It's just like, you know, like value is created through like just like the entrepreneur's like raw mental capacity and like will to run a company. And there's like no conflict. But then I think like with Marx, yeah, there is this conflict inherent in capitalism. There's just like this contradiction that we just can't ignore, and we have to find a way to deal with it.
Okay. So where can people find you or the things that you're most enthusiastic about? If they want to learn more, what should they look into? What resources?
So I think, so one of the books that I would recommend the most is probably, it's called Emancipation After Hegel by Todd McGowan. Because, yeah, I think, so like I talk about Marx a lot, but then I think there are like, I think that nowadays, I think the best way to read Marx would be through Hegel, but then reading Hegel, it's like almost impossible, like you'll go crazy. But it doesn't have to be this difficult to understand. And I think that book, it's like, it's one of the books that explains like Hegel, like the most, in like some of like the most comprehensible ways I've read. So I would really recommend that book.
Okay. So then what do you want to see in economics in the future?
I think I would like to see like a more, I would like to see a move, at the very least, a move away from like the neoclassical paradigm and like a move towards like a more progressive way of like thinking economics, and like a more, I think of like, yeah, like instead of like asking questions like something like, instead of like, how can we alleviate poverty, like how can we eliminate poverty altogether, or like how can we make like a more democratic economic system. I think that's like the questions that I'd want to see asked.
Cool. So finally, what is your advice to future economists or future law students? I guess hold both for you.
I think it's just because it's like the advice that I'm giving to anyone right now. I think it's read 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I think that's like one of the most, but I think, look, I think, okay, to be honest, yeah, I don't know how good an English translation is, because I think I just love the way that that Spanish is written, and I think it's like a very lyrical language. But I think still a lot of the themes of the book are like would still come out in English. So if you can read it in Spanish, I would highly recommend reading it in Spanish. If not, a translation would be perfectly fine. But I just think it's a wonderful book, and I think that people in general nowadays, like just instead of purely focusing on like law or like economics or like an academic field or what you work in, you also have to like just learn to like love life and like love other people and like just be the best person you can be to other people. And I think that's a book that really gives people that lesson.
Well, that's a great message. Thank you so much for making the time to talk to me. And have a
Well, no,
great day.
thank you for the invitation.